Okay, so pandemic treaty, may or may not have heard of it. Out of interest, how many of you have? One? Wow, cool. So I can basically say whatever I like and you won't have a clue. This just got a whole lot easier. Okay, we're going to have a look at that. We're going to have a look at the concept of One Health and how this relates to animal welfare policy. So I'm going to really just take us through on a whistle-stop tour of how the pandemic treaty and the broader One Health agenda. Who's heard of One Health, by the way? Yeah, cool, bit more, but I will go through what it is, how it creates unique opportunities for animal protection issues, both in the UK and more globally. So I'm going to have a look at the global context. It is important. We're going to have a look at the complexity, the convergence of risks that we're facing across health, environment, and animal systems. I will have a look at the key drivers that push those risks into the forefront and are shaping global policy, from zoonotic spillover. So zoonotic disease is diseases which transmit from animals into humans. I'll have a look at land use change and the human-led behaviours which create these problems. Why One Health has emerged as the concept to respond to these threats. Then we'll have a look at some of the multilateral instruments that are embedding One Health, so pandemic treaty. I'm then going to round this off by talking about the skin trade and how I'm using One Health, pandemic treaty, all the relevant policies around it to do some of the work that I'm doing at the moment on this trade, which you may or may not be familiar with. If I have time, I'll look at risks. And so that's what we're going to do for the next half an hour. Okay, so about me, very, very briefly, I'm Esme. I have a scientific background in public health and then animal behaviour, which everyone thought was really weird 10 years ago. And then it suddenly became quite relevant in light of all the challenges that we face. And during 2024 to 2025, I was deeply involved in the World Health Organization pandemic agreement negotiations. Very weird. Ended up getting this job, didn't really know what it was going to entail. And then they were like, by the way, you'll be doing all the advocacy on this treaty. I thought, well, I've never worked on international policy in my life, so I'm not sure how this is going to go, but it went really well. So it was based in and out of Geneva, managed the Action for Animal Health Coalition, which was the mechanism through which the organisation I worked at at the time, Brook, were channeling all of their pandemic treaty engagement. And Action for Animal Health is a coalition comprised of 14 research institutions and NGOs, and they had special stakeholder status with the WHO, which meant that we had greater access, much greater access to the negotiations and could influence them directly through providing recommendations, through compiling scientific evidence, making sure that was relayed to member states, through directly being able to hold bilaterals with them, all of that sort of stuff, and providing interventions in the negotiating chamber. As you can see, there we go. So that was what I was doing for a year, alongside a couple of other animal NGOs, and we managed to get some stuff into the treaty, which was great, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So why does this conversation matter today, or rather, why does it matter for policymakers, decision makers, member states? Well, if we look across global health, development, the geopolitical landscape, the major challenges that we face and that we are grappling with today, zoonotic spillover, that's the disease risk from animals to humans, antimicrobial resistance, if you're not familiar, that's basically the loss of these precious medicines that have been the cornerstone of human medicine for many years. They all share one feature. They emerge from the way that people interact with and treat animals and ecosystems. And this probably isn't news to anyone in this room, and I fully appreciate that. But we have been in the know for many years, but it has taken a painfully long time for it to penetrate upward into national and to global policy making. So that's why it's relevant today. And if we look back, as far as the Industrial Revolution, we can really see that human progress has been driven by the dominant paradigm of limitless economic growth and the use of nature as a resource sink, and a constellation of values and attitudes surrounding that which position the human experience as a sole repository of intrinsic value. And this prevailing world order, also known as human exceptionalism or speciesism, whatever you want to call it, is what gives rise to the systematic production, exploitation, and use of animals. And currently this is driven mostly by the rising demand for animal-based foods and products surrounding that. which in turn leads to catastrophic biodiversity loss, land use change, fragmented ecosystems, and of course disrupted wildlife livestock interfaces. So to build this out a little bit more, this insatiable demand for for animal products is currently causing approximately, and it's probably an underestimate, the loss of 90 billion terrestrial land animals being slaughtered every year and trillions of fish and marine animals. And this has driven the global biomass of farmed animals to historic highs. They now vastly outweigh wild mammals and birds. To put it into sort of a starker picture, the biomass of all of the world's wild mammals is approximately 1/3 of pigs alone. And wild mammals make up only 4% of total global biomass. And this is a real problem. There are two consequences to this. Firstly, livestock hosts are increasingly outnumbering wildlife hosts for pathogens. And secondly, the emergence of hypervirulent pathogens is much more likely in livestock systems precisely because it involves the rearing of very stressed out, immunocompromised, genetically identical animals. And that is really leading to a shift in disease ecology that we need to be talking more about. And it's also really important to highlight this because it's still very much the widely held belief that wild animal populations act as reservoirs for dangerous pathogens that then spill over into livestock. And this is something that industry and government routinely like to propagate, and they love to blame particularly wild birds on their migratory routes, just shedding their viruses into farms, etc. But a growing body of research is really challenging that, and it's showing us now that all of these animals, 20 billion chickens in the industrial farming system at any one time, are acting as their own sources of disease. And that's not to be derogatory anywhere, I'm speaking about the science here. One good example is H5N1. Is anybody familiar with that? Yeah, so the global panzootic animal pandemic, which is rattling around, particularly in the US, industrial farms, that is believed to have come from a intensive goose farm in China in 1993. Okay, so we have that density, we've got the genetic uniformity, we've got faster transmission with greater virulence, and then, of course, we move these inherently stressed immunocompromised animals around in heat-stressed environments, and so we're creating a perfect epidemiological bridge for these viruses to start spilling over into the human population. And lastly, land use change. Well, to feed all of these intensive systems, we've got to take down lots of natural habitats, which means that we're increasing the interfaces where livestock are interacting. I actually say fragmented and displaced wild animals are interacting with livestock. And so this creates more opportunities for viruses to spill over and in some cases spill back. Okay, and what does this look like in terms of health? Well, recent and ongoing outbreaks such as SARS, Ebola, COVID-19, and now highly pathogenic avian influenza demonstrate that the risks of emerging infectious diseases are escalating with both intensity and frequency. And not only that, but they're compounded by other interrelated planetary pressures such as anthropogenic, human-caused climate change, and all the other things that seem to be going on because of poor behaviour on our part, let's be honest. And you'll often hear this statistic, well, you certainly will if you're operating in the circles that I do. It's 75% of emerging infectious diseases originate in animals. I'll tap back into that in a moment. And the other big health threat, which has really pushed all this to the forefront, is AMR, antimicrobial resistance. If you're not familiar, it's where we're losing these drugs, as I said a couple of minutes ago, because of overuse and misuse in the livestock sector. And has anyone got any idea of how much of these antibiotics globally end up in livestock as a percentage?
Like 80?
Yes. Well done. Yeah, it's about 80%. Isn't that wild? Isn't that mad? And because of that, we're losing them. But the industry, well, that's a separate point. I did work on the declaration, the UN declaration on AMR, which was very frustrating since the pharmaceutical industry actually lobbied really hard to get stringent requirements in reducing antibiotics taken out, and they were successful. So at the root of all of this, it's not that these diseases emerge in animals. It's not that they're just dripping over and the animals are going around handing them out. Here you go. It's because of human-led behaviours, policies and practices and the enabling environment which allows and in many cases protects the human-led behaviours at the human-animal interface, which is causing all of this. So largely in response to all of these problems, we've had the emergence of One Health as a concept. And has anybody heard about this? Yeah, okay, cool. So some of you have. So basically, the One Health approach, it sounds really simple, and everything that happens at the global policy level is kind of quite slow and a bit basic, to be honest with you. And you're like, well, this should have happened 50 years ago, and they're only just catching up. So if you work on national policy, you'll think that's slow, and then you go into the global policy landscape, it's about 1,000,000 times slower. So anyway, One Health, as defined by the high-level expert panel, which is the UN standard definition, it is an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, ecosystems. Okay, so it recognizes that health is tightly interlinked and that it has to be dealt with as a tripartite. We can't just keep on going and dealing with human health alone. We have to look at the causes that are giving rise to the biggest global challenges today. And, you know, this is important because on an international policy level, we've got the establishment of this expert panel at the UN. That was in the wake of COVID. And we've also got the development of that definition, which was endorsed by the WHO and the quadripartite, so there are a bunch of other UN institutions. And it's really about capturing the interdependence between human, animal, and environmental health in a much more integrated way. And it's important for the reason that any policy or agreed upon language at the UN is, by its very nature, normative setting. It will then be used to inform the way that countries structure their approaches, develop the plans around anything to do with One Health. Okay. So we're seeing this recognition of the centrality of animal health and welfare as important objectives for humans, and this is increasingly being recognised and integrated into global governance. And two key examples of this are the UN Declaration on Antimicrobial Resistance in 2025. Anyone hear of that? Not many. And of course the Pandemic Treaty, which not many people seem to hear of or to know about either. Okay, so what is the Pandemic Treaty? Well, this was the picture of everybody on the final day of negotiations a year ago, pretty much. We were there for 26 hours straight, all throughout the night, lobbying intensely. So the Pandemic Treaty, or agreement, as they like to call it, because people suddenly got sensitive about a treaty as a word, it's a legally binding instrument. And the WHO adopted this agreement last year. Now, to be really clear, it is not yet open for signature. So they are still negotiating one final annex, and it was the most contentious part of the whole treaty. Of course, it was related to pathogen access and benefit sharing. That's basically the sequencing of viruses, and then a lot of money involved in sequencing viruses because you can then develop vaccines. And the global north are not being very fair in the way that they are negotiating this annex on pathogen access and benefit sharing with the global south. So it's causing a lot of delays, and there's a huge equity issue. However, if they do reach agreement, and they're meant to do that by May, then it will become open for signature, and I think you have to have 60 countries that have got to sign on for it then to be ratified. And then once it's ratified, it's probably another couple of years for entry into force. So a long-term process and goal, probably looking at another 4 years. However, it is still highly important in many ways. Okay. So why is it important for us? Why are we talking about it? Because when I first heard about it, I was like, I don't really understand the relevance. Like, what's this about? Well, it hardwires One Health as a concept that I just spoke about a moment ago, that concept which recognises that what we do to animals is important in terms of our own health. It codifies that into global health law. Okay, and if you think about it, 194 countries are signatory to the WHO. So if this agreement comes into force, they have to comply with what the agreement states. So it's got massive reach. And basically what they've done is they've adopted a legally binding agreement that explicitly recognised interdependence of human and animal and environmental health in relation to pandemic prevention. And it's the first time in international law that an agreement codifies commitments which concern human behaviour and animals, notably through Articles 4 and 5, which was the articles we were working on, which are the articles on prevention and One Health. And so that really is taking these important issues right from the periphery, where everyone just used to bury their head in the sands. A few years ago, the WHO said, we have nothing to do with animal stuff. We're a human health organisation. Go and speak to WOA. Now, that has completely changed. And it's not just rhetoric. So when it comes into force, if it does, it will set out concrete obligations and commitments on upstream drivers, the stuff that we spoke about a minute ago, and countries are obligated and mandated and legally bound to do something about those drivers. That's why it's important for us. So what does it mean for animals? Right, okay. The Emerging Pandemic Agreement, and actually I say, go and look it up. It's really simple, it's easy to read. A lot of it's boring, you just need to look at Articles 4 and 5. That's all you need to concern yourself with. The Emerging Pandemic Agreement could become the strategic scaffolding needed to confront and finally begin dismantling some of the most harmful, entrenched, and dangerous human practices at the human-animal interface. And these are the behaviours that convert hazards into risks and that fuel the conditions for zoonotic disease emergence. And this is what they're having to tackle through these articles. So for the first time, we've got the possibility of a global instrument that recognises this reality and requires action in a legally binding way. Now, it's not as good as other global instruments such as CITES, where, you know, if they don't do what they've signed up to do, then they actually get hit by trade implications. But it's symbolic, and countries generally don't like to be called out for poor behaviour when they are signed up to a treaty. They don't want that reputation, to be quite frank with you. Right, so you might be thinking, okay, well, what does this mean in reality? Well, as I've said, the fact is some of the most horrendous things that we do to animals are some of the riskiest in terms of human health. You know, fur farms, for instance, they are cauldrons of disease. When they test in fur farms, they find that high-risk viruses are there almost as a matter of certainty. And that is the true of many other intensive farming systems. And even ones that we're not routinely testing in. You know, if you think about breeding farms for game birds, you've got that high density, wherever, in fact, you've got high density, you've got lots of animals confined in intensive systems, very, very stressed, living in conditions which are nothing like how they've evolved for hundreds of thousands of years to live like, so they're immunocompromised. And these animals can act as reservoirs for harmful pathogens. So in more detail, the treaty contains explicit language on preventing transmission between humans and animals, preventing zoonotic spillover, addressing the drivers of zoonotic disease emergence. And these two bits here are actually taken from the treaty itself. And I can tell you now, the biggest arguments that we had over that year, and this is much watered down. What we wanted in this treaty was taken out, and it was, but that's the nature of an international treaty. When everybody's really unhappy, you know you've got a treaty. But this was what we were like, well, you are not taking this out. For me, it was just this face here. It was this part here. It was about addressing the drivers of infectious disease at human-animal interface. And where is it on here? So risks associated with human and animal interactions. So basically, what this means and what they're going to be mandated to do is they have to start looking upstream at the drivers, at the interface where human choices shape ecological and epidemiological risk. They are compelled to look at their own practices, each country, from wildlife markets to industrial farms to live animal supply chains, any setting or practice which presents a risk. They've got to identify that. That's what they're bound to do. And once they've done that, as per the agreement, countries have to then develop multi-sectoral national prevention, One Health strategies and plans to address those risks. So that's what they've got to do. They can't hide behind it anymore. Everyone's got to do that. They've got to look at where are the risks, and then they've got to do something about it in accordance with the One Health approach. So it's not optional, it's mandated. And for us, these are really important advocacy entry points and policy hooks that animal protection groups can use to make the case for policy and legislative change on issues which can be scientifically linked to pandemic risk. We know that there's a lot of science there that links industrial farming, wildlife trade, wet markets, and other exploitative animal-based trades. We know that they are risky. We probably need to do a lot more testing, a lot more research into other trades, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But the treaty's not asking countries to consider change. It's telling them you have to. You've got to examine, you've got to look at what you're doing, you've got to transform your practices that are endangering global health. And for the animal protection movement, this is unprecedented. Because, as I outlined, a lot of what we're doing to animals carries huge risk. Okay, so I'm running out of time. But One Health is not only being integrated into the pandemic agreement, it's coming up and cropping up in lots of other policy instruments. For instance, CITES, for those of you that aren't familiar, is the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species. We were at the COP in December. Now, a resolution was put forward by Senegal on One Health at that COP. It was a really good resolution, to be fair, but they put it forward the day before. And so countries were like, no, we're not going to accept that. It's too late. But it's laid the groundwork. And now CITES are starting to talk about One Health in relation to the mandate of CITES. So this is what treaties are all interested in. They're like, we'll talk about One Health and we'll even perhaps adopt decisions. Maybe we'll even take on a resolution. But it has to be very tightly focused to the mandate of that particular treaty. And this is important with CITES if you're working in the wildlife sector and your work involves wild animal trades, or it involves the movement of animals across borders, which is why I'm interested in CITES. And then you've got CBD, not working actively on CBD at the moment, but will be over the next few years. It's far ahead of nearly all other multilateral instruments in forming One Health. You've also got CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, and then Ramsar on wetlands. Right, really quick. Okay, there are a couple of unpleasant images here, just to give you a pre-warning. So, out of interest, has anybody here heard of the donkey skin trade? Okay, not many. So, I'm going to give you a really broad strokes overview of what I'm working on at the moment and what I'm doing. So basically, this is a global, relentless, chaotic, and shockingly cruel trade in which 5 million donkeys are bought, captured, often stolen from donkey-dependent communities every year. 5 million. There's only 50 million donkeys in the world. Okay, they're not a prolific species, and they're not very good at procreating. And it's being driven by a demand for the gelatin in donkey skins, which is then used in ancient Chinese remedies. Okay. Graphic images coming up. So these animals are often trekked across hundreds of miles, across borders, put into overcrowded trucks, unknown health status, mixed, and then they are slaughtered in the most horrendous ways. And I'm not going to go on about that, but we have done some undercover work, and it's truly the most horrendous, horrific thing you have ever seen. And this is happening at around 6 million of them a year, and there's only 50 million of them, and they're not great breeders. The trade is voracious. Okay, so graphic content. Yeah, and we also know it presents profound biosecurity risks. So we've done some testing, only some. We're about to grow that, but we've done some testing from one abattoir with skins, and what we found is that these skins contain all sorts of nasty viruses, including Staphylococcus aureus and MRSA. So we know that they're a biosecurity risk. Okay. And we also know this converges with other wildlife crimes. So we know that when donkey skins, because this is not a CITES listed species, so people can kill and trade this, they can send it around the world depending on where you are, and it's not illegal. We know that the skins are being used to conceal other CITES listed species and their products. So things like pangolin scales, hardwoods, tiger bone, etc., etc. So we know that that's happening. And for instance, just a few months ago in October, there was a big seizure. $200 million worth of donkey skins were found alongside shark fins and other CITES-listed species. Okay, so what are we doing in a nutshell? I am looking at stronger scientific evidence. So we're looking at doing some testing, partnering with universities, doing a disease risk analysis. What are the risks from this trade, and what are the risks as it interacts with other trafficking of species and animal products across the world? We are doing strategic coalition building. It's very difficult to talk about the donkey skin trade in certain audiences because people are like, donkeys, so what? They're not an emblematic species. Not many people know about this trade. So it doesn't have that sort of catchiness when you're working at the multilateral level. So we're looking at building coalitions with other wildlife trades. And we are also doing a lot in terms of corporate sector engagement. Now, if you're working on animal trades, as you will know, one of the biggest and most important parts of that is transit and transport, how these products get shipped around the world. And we're working with air carriers and shipping liners to really, discuss the risks with them. And actually, they're highly receptive because shipping carriers and transit sector stakeholders in general do not want to be shipping dangerous pathogens around the world. And since we've started to introduce the One Health lens, the pandemic agreement, as these kind of hooks for when we're talking to these stakeholders, we've had really quick sign-on. Whereas it took 3 years to get 3 major airline carriers signed on to not carrying skins as a policy, we had 2 signed up in the last 6 months. So this is an argument that really does hold a lot of sway. So One Health holds immense potential to drive transformative change for animals when it's done properly. But there are risks. You know, and this is why I'm here today talking to you, because it has been co-opted by mostly the human health sector, who don't really understand animal welfare at all, so they're just really using it as another trendy label for what is effectively public health interventions. And you'll see things like, you know, a cull of chickens being a One Health approach. That's absolutely not what it is in relation to the definition put forward by the UN. So it is supposed to be ecologically oriented, justice-aware framework about humans, animals, and environment. What we're seeing is that in some cases there is welfare washing, there's ethical appropriation, and you've got industries such as, you know, big agriculture coming in there and using it as a form of reputation management. And these are all reasons why we need better representation from animal protection advocates who are able to advocate from a research-based, ethically informed standpoint and talk about, you know, the causes that you're working on in this context. Okay, right, I think I'm right on time. So I had to miss out a few bits, but thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to talk to anyone who may have questions at the end. Thank you.